would like to say something about the outline of my lecture, and I have divided it into the following parts. First, I will talk about women and life writing. This will be more theoretical part. Then we will continue and focus on Zofka Kveder, and I will tell something about her life, her trajectory, but not a lot. Then even less about her Kveder's autobiographical discourse, because I would really like to focus on narratives about her by her contemporaries. So I will not explore texts that were written after, much later after her death, but written by her contemporaries. So let us begin with this first part, which is actually a brief summary of the most important elements of the act of writing a biography. Especially, I will focus on biographies of women. So this is now the first part, and it is of course clear that the first step in the process of preparing the material for biography is that in compiling more or less important events in the life of a person, the process of selection takes place. And this process, of course, follows different criteria. Of course, when we are writing a biography, we are striving for coherence, consistency in the narrative, but it is very difficult question how we decide what is important and what is not important. It seems that sometimes these decisions also come from our ideological backgrounds. And the most contested elements of women's lives in biographies are sexuality, then also connected to this gender, and often also religion. And we will explore all this further in relation to Kveder's biographies. But first, let's do a very brief overview of the role of gender in the history of the life writing. So now I would like to ask you to pose you a question. Um, have you read a biography of a woman recently, or if not recently, let's say ever? So if you have, then I would kindly ask you just to write the name of this, the title, or just the name of this person who was or is the subject of the book that you have read and is a biography about some woman. So if you could write this in the chat, or you can also tell as you prefer, but sometimes people don't like to speak in the webinars or talks. So perhaps Alenka, you could have a look, or even I
Yeah.
perhaps. So let us see if we find something in the chat. I will not ask any other questions, just this one, because I'm really interested if you have read any biography about a woman, not necessarily a woman writer, just about a woman. I don't see anything in the chat.
I I don't see either. But perhaps later they can write.
Okay.
I know the people,
What
but they
about
can
you,
write.
Alenka?
Ah, I read a lot of them, but I don't
So
know
just say one.
now. Lyudmila Polyanets. I'm
Okay,
researching her.
so this is actually a woman writer, a poet, a Slovenian poet, but often often women writers are not the subject, or recently they are, but earlier that was not always the case. So if we really look back to the probably first biography, which is Plutarch's Lives, then we have to admit that there is no woman in this, in let's say, book, in this work. And it is really so that Western history has a long time been written by men and also about men. But later, in the Middle Ages, we have two very interesting books which belong to the biographical discourse, and perhaps you have already heard about them. So the first one, which is very interesting, is written by Giovanni Boccaccio, and it is called in English Concerning Famous Women. So famous women. And then the second one, which is even, I think, more interesting, and this is the book that was inspired by Boccaccio. This is the famous, very famous, beautiful book. I don't know if you have read this book. If not, I envy you, because to read it for the first time, it is really such a revelation. So this is Book of the City of the Ladies. And this book was written, let's say, 40 years later, and it was completed around 1400. And this book, here is one image from this book, also consists of short biographical texts about famous women in history. But what is different from Boccaccio is the fact that these women are housed in the City of Ladies, which is actually the book. And as Christine de Pizan builds her city, she uses the biography of each of those women, famous women, as a building block, not only for the walls and houses of the city, but also as building blocks for her thesis. And each woman added to the city contributes to Pizan's argument for women as valued participants in the society. So she shows that women are important, have been important in the history, in literature, in different fields. But even, of course, as you can see on this image below Boccaccio's name, also in the Pizan's book, these women are, of course, women who held positions, queens, empresses, artists, or women who wielded power through men. And that changed many centuries after the Pizan. In the 16th, in the 17th century, we have some biographical texts also about women, but of course about important women, I mean, queens and so on. Books about, let's say, women writers appear only later, let's say in the 19th century, I mean, a lot of them. A single one have been there also before, and I will also talk about them, one of those early biographies later. Why is this so important then in the 19th century? Because in the 19th century, this is the century of women's movement. And of course, in the 19th centuries, women learned that it is important to have foremothers. So I quoted here Virginia Woolf and her famous sentence from A Room of One's Own, for we think back through our mothers if we are women. So this is why our foremothers are so important, or at least were important in the past. And of course, if you have read her brilliant novel, biographical actually novel Orlando, you know that she put a lot of thought into the portrayal of women's lives and was aware of the issues of gender when writing biography. So nowadays, more and more biographies are written about women, and women feel that their story needs to be recorded to fill the gap and bring to light, uncover, reveal, reclaim the lives of their predecessors. So the journey that women have taken to overcome the barriers in a world that has been dominated by men for centuries, this all is so important and interesting even today. I hope not just for women. Biography is therefore a genre very important to feminism, and we have to be aware that narrating a story about a woman is a very tricky process. So I will show why this process is so difficult and so tricky. So let's take as a starting point the fact that the historical and literary contexts in which biographies are published, as well as personal and political agendas of the biographers, influence life writing. I think this is very important that we are aware of this in a way that they can form and transform biography's reputation. So biography is a person about whom the writer writes in the biography. And the reasons for leaving something out are many and varied, and are often related um, to the fact that there is actually no neutrality. So this is something that we have to be also aware of, and that there is only greater or less awareness of one's bias. So if you do not appreciate the force of what are you leaving out, you are not fully in command of what are you doing. This is a quote from Caroline Heilbronn, who is a very famous feminist scholar who wrote a lot about biographical discourse, and she also wrote biographies. The reasons, as I said, are very varied, and often the biographer feels an admiration and friendship or a benevolence, and this is also not always good. So if we like this person too much, then we would perhaps also omit something or leave out from her life what we don't like. So this relationship is of admiration could also be sometimes problematic, but as much problematic it can also be if the author's intention is to show the life which should not serve as role model for anyone. So if I write a biography just to show that such this kind of I don't know, life is not something that you should follow, let's say so. And here I posted a photo from my Slovenian colleague who explored the first Slovenian poet and writer, prose writer, Josipina Turnograjska. She also wrote a biography, and as you see, she is very enthusiastic about everything concerning Josipina Turnograjska. So she even she did now she I think she does not do it anymore, but she also had a kind of lectures and guided tours in this mansion or castle, small castle, where Josipina Turnograjska lived. So this relationship can be very tricky, as I said, and to be a biographer is not an easy task, but it can also be, of course, and it is rewarding, a rewarding experience, because being a biographer means that we are gaining the experience to know a new acquaintance. Maybe we are in a very perhaps odd way, but we are becoming a friend with this person. Then we are also learning that life writing brings with it pains and pleasures of human encounter. And last but not least, that recognizing resonances between them, so that there are also moments of recognition, rejection, and also surprise. So life experience cannot be located separately from the interpretation. So this is what I would like really to show, how difficult it is to write a biography, because somehow you are always in a kind of a relationship with the biography, so the person about whom you are writing. And here, of course, one very important question then arises, and this question is how pure this interpretation is. So this may sound strange. So let me explain this with the metaphor of the hall of mirrors. And so it means that often the biography reflects more of the biographer and his or her audience than the subject herself. And let me illustrate this with an example about a biographical discourse at Mary Wortley Montagu. Okay, I think that I would skip this, and now we are here. You see this interesting image of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was an English aristocrat, letter writer, and poet. And her writings address and challenge the hindering contemporary social attitudes towards women and their intellectual and social growth. And what is interesting, when, of course, she was very courageous woman, but later she travels also to the Ottoman Empire and wrote letters from there. But later, when in the 19th century, when biographies were written about Mary Wortley Montagu, so Victorian biographies, they recast her as a moral heroine and a genteel proto-feminist palatable to a Victorian readership. So many scandalous aspects of her life story must be marginalized, and the noble ones, particularly her mentorship to another very important English early feminist, Mary Estelle, and her own grandmothers who were also feminists. All this was emphasized or even glozed over, and what was not so acceptable for the Victorian female readership, that was then omitted. Another interesting case is from from the American feminist history. Here you see quotes and images, photos of two very important American feminists, suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And what is interesting is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote in a letter to Susan B. Anthony this sentence. So I quote now from the letter. I do think in the earlier part of your life, there should be some mysterious references to some faint suffering love affair. If your sisters can glean any facts in that line from your true inwardness, nothing could be more agreeable to me than to weave a sentimental chapter entitled, for instance, The Romance of Susan B. Anthony's Younger Days. So Susan B. Anthony was single. She was, as I said, a feminist. And when they were discussing what should be included in the memories of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's or in some other biography, Elizabeth Cady Stanton emphasized that it is so important that something about her life should be included in this biographical text. And why was this so important? Even though actually Susan B. Anthony didn't have any romances, because she was really not interested. Actually, she dedicated all her life to her work as a suffragist and a feminist. But even though there was nothing actually to be reported about, another feminist felt that somehow it should be emphasized. And why was that? Because in the 19th century and also in the early 20th century, women who refused to be married, to be dependent on men, were often portrayed as fanatically driven, as unfulfilled and incomplete women. Here I would just like to remind you on the character of Olive Chancellor in Henry James' The Bostonians. This is a very famous and very interesting novel by Henry James. And this wonderful character of Olive, who is really very brave and and really a feminist, is not really portrayed very positively. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton knew that an account of her best friend's life would have justified also Anthony's work and her political life. So otherwise, she would not be so good accepted. She would not be perhaps seen as, let's say, a normal woman. So we see that a biographer must also be very critical and I would say, a very critical and honest friend of the biography. And that also means that a biographer recognizes self-fashioning of the biography, and how she or he can find it. Of course, she has to read life writing, letters, diaries, um, but not just letters and diaries. Sometimes you can also find a kind of autobiographical self-fashioning also, of course, in the paintings. So before we move on to the second part of the lecture, I would like to summarize what we have learned so far by posing some questions to which we will try to find answers when focusing on Zofka Kveder. So the first important question when we are exploring a biographical discourse is a relationship between a biographer and biography. I hope that I could show this well in the first part. So it is important if there is identification or with the feminist, let's say, foremother, or separation from them. So also this separation is very important, because if I say that we look back we look back to our foremothers, if we are women, or think through our foremothers, there is also a question: do I want it? Do I want to think through her? And another important question is also, of course, is she the mother? I want to think through her. So this relationship is, of course, very important. Then another important question is, what kind of motivation is hidden behind the omission of some events or character traits? So what are we doing this? Why are we leaving something out? Of course, we don't have, there are spatial limitations, of course, if we are writing a book, but perhaps we are not leaving something out just because they have a lot of marriage crisis, and then her own extramarital affair also happens. In 1906, they leave for Zagreb, and here in Zagreb, she gives birth to her second daughter, Masha. And years in the following years, she continues her successful career. She's also active as a journalist for a German newspaper Agramer Tagblatt in Zagreb. She's also editor, reviewer, and translator and writer, and so on. In 1911, her first daughter, Mirica, was born, and the marriage with Jelošek was or has been very turbulent in the, let's say, Zagreb years, and even the birth of Mirica could not save it, so they divorced in 1912, and a year later she marries again, and her second husband is Jure Demetrovic, a journalist at that time, but later, after the First World War, he became a very important politician in the Yugoslav government, and they were really hated by many people, especially, of course, nationalists in Croatia. So Kveder felt very isolated, also because he stayed for most of the time in Belgrade. And then something really, really difficult and tragic happened in Prague, where she studied. Vladosha died. Um, Later in the years to follow, these years were really very difficult. Her husband was having an affair and he wanted a divorce, and she suffered really badly from depressions. And so on 21st of November in 1926, she committed a suicide. Let's go back to the PowerPoint presentation and continue with Kveder and biographical and autobiographical discourse. So perhaps when you read the title of my lecture, you assumed that I would talk a lot about her autobiographical works, about her writings. And this, of course, might be a case because Kveder wrote a lot about her in her works and her writings. And she even said once that, well, I will quote her. She said, "I believe we women always write only about ourselves, our yearnings, our hearts." Um, so Kveder wrote about events she participated in, or had her heroines express the feelings and thoughts that were also her own, as we can infer from her essays. But today we will not go into this fascinating topic, but we'll try to find out how much autobiographical traits are hidden, of biographers are hidden in the biographical discourse about her. And here I have again a very interesting quotation by her friend, Edwin Kristen, who also wrote an article, a biographical article about Kveder, and he wrote in this article as follows. So I will now quote. When a person talks about an acquaintance, it is inevitable that he will sometimes mention himself. Therein lies the danger that while telling the story, he forgets his task and begins to write an autobiography, which can sometimes be interesting, but the reader does not expect it and is therefore disturbed. You see, it is not necessary for a narrator to be greedy or in love with his ego. Altogether, it can be a simple clumsiness, or the subject is a little too convoluted. In any case, it sometimes happens, said Tristan, and I'm sure he knew what he said, because, as I said, he also wrote biographical works. So let's now incorporate again a little bit of theory and scholarship about Kveder in our lecture. And I would like to mention Natasha Vittorelli, a scholar who explored Kveder. And she wrote this really compelling book about her, and she argued that in the narrative about Kveder, as a great feminist, some facts about her life are withheld. And Vittorelli looked for intersections to find these facts. She looked at the intersection of different discourses, and she also departed from the notion of site of discourse as as explored by Joanne Wallach Scott. Therefore, Vittorelli sees Kveder as figure in which different discourses are located. And Vittorelli also departs from Scott's book about the, let's say, the paradigm shift, where she writes that feminist historical heroines should not be seen just as exemplary heroines. So she is interesting in finding the ways through which the person became historical agent, and this is exactly what Victorine is doing in her book. And then she concludes that in the narrative about Kveder, the superlatives of the greatest writer and feminist prevail, but it is also the narrative of female suffering and rebellion. And now I would like to explore different texts, not explored by Vittorelli, because she is interested in scholarly texts about Kveder, but I will now go into the text written by her contemporaries, and not just, let's say, text, but literary text. So where Kveder actually appear as a literary character. And the first text that we are going to discuss is Vladimir Yeloushek's poetry volume. And this is a poetry and prose, actually, collection, Symphonia. Symphonia 2 is the title. And it is interesting how she is depicted, how she is presented, because, of course, at the turn of the century, a typical life of a girl from the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, where Catholic and bourgeois morality dictated, complete sexual abstinence before marriage, submission to parents, and respect for the bourgeois code of conduct for unmarried women. This would be a typical life, but Kveder, of course, departed from this model, and she lived her life in completely different way. And of course, this inspired Yeloushek, who was first her fiance and then later her husband, to dedicate this book to her. And his Sonia, he namely uses a Russian derivative of her name, is a decadent lover. Her eyes are sick and have a frightening gleam. She resembles the look of a deer hearing the footsteps of a hunter. So I use now some quotations from the poems and also prose of Yeloushek. And she trembles nervously, her lips quiver, she is afraid of life, and the poet is her guide, who reassures her, puts his hand on her soft dark hair, and she looks at him with happy, warm, and kind eyes, from which great confidence and immense happiness shine. But at the same time, of course, we have a decadent poetry. She's tall, pale, majestic. Her body moves in unusual gestures like the rhythms, as he writes, of a silent and nervous symphony. And he, the poet, feels like a tiger pouncing on its prey, but she looks at him innocently, like a child running into the arms of its nurse. So then she gives him hand, a strong white hand with an energetic, unconventional gesture. Then there is also a very interesting short story, actually a sketch, Cielo, which means a kiss in Croatian language. And this is a confession of the first love experience. And the female character talks about her love for Edward, the storm they experienced together, and the loss of innocence in the barn. So this is very interesting because Kveder also depicts this scene from her life, but she depicts it in completely different way. And Edwin Kristen, whom I mentioned earlier, recalled years later in his memories that I also mentioned before of Kveder that when the book had been printed and Zofka held it in her hand, she was very depressed. And she said, people who will be reading this will think that this has really happened. And even without this, they consider me some kind of Maria Magdalena, and now they will find confirmation in this story. And Kristan adds, quite some time has passed before I was able to cheer her up. So I think this is really interesting because it shows that how different they wrote about the same scene, and how much Yellowshek was influenced by the decadent movement. And what is also intriguing is that at the same time as Yellowshek established Zofka or Sonia as an erotically emancipated, sexually engaged woman, he also gives her gives new traits to the image of young feminist. And that was something that was an image that we don't find in this really sexually engaged woman was not something that we would find in her autobiographical works. But what he leaves out is actually this how much she was engaged in everyday struggle for survival, and how much she was interested in social reality, how critical she was about the situation of other women. So everything is left out. Sonia is just this decadent mistress and emancipated woman. This collection is then at the end of this collection is a poem by the Czech modernist, of course you know him, poet and writer Josef Satopluk-Macher, who also wrote about Kveder. And he wrote about it in an article, and he described her. This was an article published in the newspaper Čas, and he described her as one of the most beautiful and purest souls, as a working and optimistic person who was brought to Prague by her thirst for knowledge. But as Maher writes, she was not accepted with open arms, but with snobism and petit bourgeois narrowness. And at the end, he calls her a little Slovenian dove with a good and golden heart. So, as we see, Kveder is again compared with an animal. But Mahar's text is interesting because it features Kveder as a young, sunny person full of life, and this image is then later also enhanced in the writings of Zdenka Haskova, and she reflected on their first meeting in one poem, as you see here, but also later in the collection Cesto, and later also in an article about their friendship. And in this text, she also writes about Kveder's luminous personality, about her creative geniality, and the focus is on Kveder's character traits, so positive energy, then childlike homeliness, deep wisdom, sincerity, and natural human pride. Sorry. And she also mentions that there have been some darker traits in her friend's character, but they were such that culture can remove them, or they can be found everywhere among people and or even in oneself. So she said that true friendship, like love, defies everything. And, the view of a contemporary is also revealed in the article by Ivan Lach, and this text was also published when Kveder was still alive in 1922, and he describes her as a diligent, determined, and combative woman, and recalls a scene when he visited her, and he writes, I quote, Vlada was entertaining herself with her toys, mostly pictures, books, and Zofka was making tea and writing something on the kitchen table where books, papers, pens, teacups, and other dishes were lying. And he continues some pages later. Once I came to her apartment late in the evening. The room was dark because there was no money for petroleum, and there was also nothing to welcome the guests. Anybody else would be angry and depressing. Not Sofka. She was lively discussing with her guests different issues. So, um, interestingly, Kveder was very upset about his works and wrote to the editor of the journal, where Lach's texts have been published, as follows. I'm angry with him because he depicted me as a disorderly woman. I gladly admit I cooked 100 times baby's food and fed her as other mothers. And when somebody had come to visit me, I was sitting with the sweet and full child in my arms and was chatting with the guest about theater, books, magazines, exhibitions, and so on. So here we see also something about the self-fashioning, and of course how tense this relationship can be between biographer and biography. Um, then we have another interesting memory from her friend Frankovica. He wrote also his article when Kveder was still alive, and this happened some months before she died, because she was so depressed, and she came to him and his wife Minka, and she confided what happened to her, so that her husband wanted to divorce her, and Frank Govekar wanted to cheer her something, to cheer her up, and to write something positive about her, and then he wrote that how extremely diligent again she is, how she is a woman of unparalleled talent in in the Slovenian literature, and a woman of wide Slavic horizons, and how courageous she was, and how good she knew life in all its depths and heights. And Govekar's text was actually the last of this kind, written when Kveder was still alive, and other were written and published after her death. Actually, I am now a little bit I have more than a half, I would say, not more than less than half of my lecture, but perhaps you would need a short break. I don't know. Should we make a short break?
Yes, we can, of course. Here we have in the chat something.
Yeah, let me see.
Yes, Alžbieta wrote.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, that was exactly what I was talking about, that these important women from history, like queens and other empresses and so on, are often depicted, but not so often women who are writers or in any way important later in the history. But that, of course, has changed. And this is what I wanted to emphasize. So I don't know, shall we continue or have a short break for 5 minutes? I see that you have your cup of tea.
As ever you wish. We could have a break, or if you want to continue, I suppose that you can continue. I don't know what the others think. Nobody says anything. What do you think? No answers.
Juliana,
I'm okay, but
okay. Okay, then let me continue, but I will try to summarize what I have, because otherwise we will be too long. So let me share again my screen. I also wanted to talk about obituaries, because after her death, many obituaries were written, but I would just like to focus on 3 of them, because they were written by her fellow feminists, and in case of Markovic and Govekar, they were also friends. And we see here that Zdenka Markovic, she was a Croatian writer, scholar, feminist as well, and she wrote that Kveder was one of the smartest, most unhappy women among us. And also about her difficult times, how she was ridiculed and attacked. This is all, and unhappy because of that. This is also something that Govekar emphasized. And on the other hand, Ida Runjanin, all these obituaries were published in Serbian journals or newspapers. She emphasized that actually Kveder was a kind of a role model for her, because she admired her kindness, her sincerity, openness, and somehow she felt inspired by her. Minka Govekar wrote later also a text that was published in many installments in the journal Ženski Svet. This was a Slovenian journal, and she wrote a lot about her. But what is interesting in this work is that Kveder is depicted as a person with a wide network. So by writing this kind of biographical text, she establishes also Kveder's feminist work. And in her contribution, in Govekar's contribution, the main characteristic of the feminist biography is actually involved, and this is according to Liz Stanley, a very important scholar in the field of biographical discourse, that the biographer should put the biography into the network of feminists, and this is realized for the first time in Minka Govekar's text. Then we have also a very interesting contribution about Kveder from Julka Hlapec-Đorđević. But I will now not go into this because I don't have a lot of time, and this will be, I think, also the topic of our next CEEPUS webinar. So this will be the topic of the lecture of Professor Alenka. So I will leave this out and will focus on another very interesting text written by Kveder's very, very good friend, an Austrian, Marta Tausk, who wrote actually a short novella and included, this novella is called The Story of a Friendship, and this is included in the collection of novellas by Marta Tausk. And in this work, she's interested again in Kveder's. You will now recall these words again from before again. Magnificent free personality, and she writes about a warm love towards Kveder and lasting fidelity that bound her with Kveder. But what is very interesting in this text is that she also reflected upon her own narrative technique. So she tells that she actually will tell only what Kveder told her, so what remained in her memory. And when she writes about the moments in Kveder's life, then also the events from her own life intercalate, and the biography actually again transcends its borders and passes into the biography. So this is not something that would happen just to Edvin Kristen, but the same happens also to Marta Tausk when she writes Kveder's when she writes a portrait of Kveder. And it is also interesting that this narrative is not linear, but she looks retrospectively into the past, and at a certain point the narrative changes into a dialogue with the dead friend, and she speaks directly to her and apologizes for not understanding her completely in the last years of her life. And in all those texts, positive traits, as you see, prevailed. But then we have another novel, another very interesting text, and this is a novel with a key, roman à clef, Biegunci, by fugitives, by August Cesarec, a Croatian writer. And this novel was published in 1933. And why is this a novel with a key? Because behind protagonist of this novel, Buga Vlatković, Kveder's daughter Vladosha, is actually hidden, and the story in the novel tells how Buga's Buga is the name of the protagonist, how Buga's father tried to abuse her because she resembled her mother, and it tells also about he depicts Mrs. Majstorović, who is actually Zofka Kveder, as haughty, arrogant woman. He writes about her egocentricity and hysteria. So it is really a very bad image of Kveder hidden behind this character of Mrs. Majstorović, which is actually a very one-dimensional character, and this work actually idealizes the representatives of the young generation, whereas the representatives of the old generation are presented with the drastic features, and also the author often passes into the trivial exaggerations. And it also shows this character of Mrs. Majstorović and testifies to a complete lack of the author's empathy and with the position of a woman writer in the interwar Croatian society. So let's come now to the conclusion. Biographers did not write about certain events in Kveder's lives. Nobody wrote actually about Kveder's suicide attempts and her suicide. Either they don't write about it or mention the official cause of that as being a heart attack. Then also what is submitted are Jeloušek's love affairs, of course, except by Cesarec, who really writes extensively about them. And what is also left out is her own extramarital affair. I think that just one of them briefly mentions it. And even more, I think, problematic is that the anti-Semitism is also actually omitted and not reflected upon, and this happened not only in the literary text that I presented, but also in the scholarly text. And actually, the first who mentioned this issue was Natasha Vittorelli in 2004. Vittorelli also drew attention to the writer's indignation written in an unsent letter preserved in her legacy to the editor of the satirical newspaper Koprive, which means nettles. This happened after this newspaper or journal published a caricature of Kveder, where she is depicted, as you can see, as a Jewish seller of articles in the market. And Vittorelli states that Zofka Kveder's husband, Jure Demetrović, made the editor of the newspaper resign. Moreover, the author of the pamphlet against Kveder lost his job as a professor at the Zagreb Grammar School. And of course, these activities do not place Kveder in the light in which her biographers observe her, and and she reveals herself to us as, let's say, self-satisfied and vengeful woman who took advantage of the position of the stronger, in this case, the wife of an important politician in the Yugoslav government of the time, over the weaker. And at the end of the chapter on Zofka Kveder, Vittorelli then argues that the narrative about Kveder is, of course, the narrative of the greatest woman writer and feminist, but it is also the narrative about female suffering and rebellion. And of course, in her, the discourses, or in this narrative, the discourses of feminism, socialism, patriotism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism meet. Diverse attempts at presenting Zofka Kveder as a kind of a cultural and feminist icon of the South Slavic space opens up various questions about the ways of glorifying the author's role in different literary systems and concealing the truth about certain characteristics that were inconsistent with the positive image of Kveder as a feminist role model for younger generations. It seems that the biographical the contributions written later stemmed mainly from the image of Kveder as the role model of a writer and a feminist, and that there was obviously the need for such a role model of the strong and successful writer and feminist on whom it was possible to build a tradition parallel to the dominant male and patriarchal discourse of Slovenian literary history. And these strategies testified to both the positive, ambitious aspirations and problematic contradictions involved in constructing early feminist icons and role models. And I would now really like to conclude by saying that confronting all the traits of a biograph personality is ultimately, and I can say this also from my own experience because I also wrote a short biography of Kveder, that always that confronting all these traits is ultimately always confronting oneself. Or as the biographer of the American feminist Jessie Daniel Amos said when she, or wrote when she discovered the darker sides of her personality, I quote here I had to struggle not just with concern about discrediting an admirable woman, but with my own feelings of disappointment, even perhaps dislike. So in this sense, I would say that feminist discourse, especially feminist biographical discourse, reveals itself as ambivalent and as such still presents particular challenge for its creation and exploration. So with this, I would conclude, although I have, of course, prepared something more, as you can see, but perhaps you have some questions, and I would be very interested